Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad to be here with everybody tonight. Happy Saturday. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. We are going to have ourselves a live stream. We're going to have a great conversation. Let's do it.
Of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Hey, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. It's really good to be here with all of you tonight. We are now on all platforms streaming. So shout out to everyone who's watching. Always fun to have you here. We're going to do another one of our shows like we always do. We're going to do another one of our shows. And the way this works is I give my opening remarks. While I am giving my opening remarks, I am writing down your questions. Now, questions come in various ways. On YouTube, the questions come in as super chat questions. On Rockfin, they come in as tip questions. And on the Rumble, our exciting new platform, on the Rumble, they come in as Rumble rants. If you have something you want me to talk about, send me a super chat, send me a tip on Rockfin, or send me a Rumble rant, and I will be writing them down as I go. That's the way we do things here. So yeah, the way it is I give my opening remarks. Then we do the roll call where I call you all out as I see you, names and locations. And then from there, I answer questions for the rest of the night. So like I said, if there's something you want me to talk about in the second half of our program tonight, shoot me a super chat, a Rumble rant, or a Rockfin tip. I will be keeping a solid count and writing all of them down as I go. And the second half of our show is me boom, 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 booming them out. And Timoshenko is right. We need a government of action to fight for working families. A government of action to fight for working families. What do we need? We need a government of action to fight for working families. That is the slogan of the Center for Political Innovation. We've had it from the beginning, and it suits us well. Very good question. Good question to start out with. I wrote it down. That'll be the first question I answer in the second half of the program. So thank you very much, James, for that super chat question. A couple quick reminders before we get going. Quick reminder that there's a National Day of Action coming up. On August 6th, there's going to be a big protest at the United Nations. It is the anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. And so there will be Humanity for Peace 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. at the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza. There will be a demonstration, and there will be a protest in Chicago, and there will be a protest in Portland, Oregon, and in Seattle, and in Sacramento. All over the country, people are going to be in the streets saying no to nuclear war and peace with Russia, peace with China. And we at the Center for Political Innovation, we're going to be a big part of that. We are going to be a big part of these protests. I am going to be at the one in New York, and I know CPI members from Pennsylvania and New Jersey and New York City and upstate New York, and they're coming in. We're going to be a big part of it. And in addition to that, we're going to be a big part of it in Portland and in Chicago and elsewhere. So I hope that folks will make a point of going to the Humanity for Peace demonstrations. Nick Brana of the People's Party is supporting it. Angela, the new chair of the Libertarian Party, she is supporting it as well. It's going to be really, really important. So we want to stand for peace in these times. So I wanted to make folks aware of that. And another reminder that I want to make everyone aware of: every day on the Center for Political Innovation YouTube channel, every single day, not once a week, not 5 times a week, but every single day, we have a morning message on the Center for Political Innovation YouTube channel so that people can start their day with revolutionary hope and optimism. And we just had a great message that went up this morning from Sam Bismuth. Sam Bismuth Hertz, he made a great message, 10 minutes long, longer than usual, about his experiences in the Center for Political Innovation, what the organization has meant to him. And tomorrow morning, there'll be another message from someone who you shall be surprised by. You will not know who they are. You won't see it coming, but it's going to be a great message. So go and subscribe to the CPI YouTube channel and make a point of starting your day with revolutionary hope and optimism, right? With anti-imperialism. That's what we are here to do. We are here to give those among us who have an anti-imperialist, revolutionary understanding of the world hope and optimism to keep going in this world. So that is what we need you to do. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Keep August 6th in mind, the August 6th demonstrations. Keep in mind that you can watch a CPI member give their update on what it's like to be a member and give you hope and optimism to start your day. Go and subscribe to the CPI YouTube channel so you get our morning messages, and make sure to listen to them every morning. They're very important. And on that note, I am going to open my opening remarks. I'll be writing down people's super chat questions as they come in. So keep the super chats rolling in, so I have something to talk about in the second half of our program. And now let's jump right into it. My opening remarks begin. So, folks, politics. There's an old joke. It goes like this: that the word politics comes from Greek. It comes from poly, meaning many, and ticks, meaning blood-sucking parasites. It's a clever one-liner. I think it was the Smothers Brothers, who were like a comedy duo who used to appear on, American television in the 1960s. I think that was their one-liner. But the way we're taught to think about politics is almost like the way we're taught to think about sports. I used to work with the great newscaster, Ed Schultz. And Ed Schultz, he was a college football player. He was an athlete, and he became a college football radio announcer. And then he got into politics, and it worked out just fine because he would talk about politics as if it was sports. And he would talk about, a rising star in the Senate. I think he's going someplace. He would talk about it, and that fit American television like a glove. I mean, he went from local radio in Wisconsin to Air America Radio, and then he went to MSNBC. He got booted off MSNBC. RT gave him a platform. He was a huge supporter of Bernie Sanders, and he tragically died. And it was really an honor to work with Ed Schultz. Ed Schultz was a dedicated Bernie Sanders supporter. And he was a great guy. And the reason that he rose up the ranks of American broadcast, right? I mean, all the way from local radio to MSNBC, he had the Ed Show for a while, was because he approached politics the way you're supposed to think about politics in America, which is like team sports. We have the red team, which is the Republicans. We have the blue team, which is the conservatives, or the Democrats. That's a good question. And that's how you're supposed to think about politics. Well, I'm not here to tell you that people who think about politics that way are bad people or they're wrong. But that's not the way we think about politics on these streams. We think about politics with a level of depth and analysis that you can only get from understanding Marxism, historical and dialectical materialism, political economy. We give you a level of analysis that you won't get elsewhere. That's what we give to you on these streams. And I strive to give you that level of analysis on these streams, to get you thinking about things on a deeper level. And the tradition that I come from in how one engages in Marxist political analysis is that one, if you are a Marxist political analyst, your job is to tell what's happening and not necessarily assume that people know what's happening. Tell the whole story of what's happening. Highlight things that, mainstream media may not be highlighting. Make people aware of things they may not be aware of. Tell people what's happening. But then from there, use Marxism to explain why it's happening. Why it's happening. And that requires an understanding of the economy, of historical materialism, dialectical materialism, the nature of the state, the nature of imperialism, the nature of the global economy. And then from there, once you've told why it's happening, it is your assignment, is your duty to then tell your audience what they can do about it. And so, with that tradition of analysis, I am going to help you to understand where we're at in America right now. Because I have spent my entire adult life, I started doing political stuff when I was like a teenager. I wasn't very active until I was like an adult, when I had, full agency as an adult. I've been doing political stuff since the Bush years. And it has taken me a long time to understand what's actually been happening. It took me a really, really long time to get the level of depth that I have now. So I'm going to walk you through what's been happening in American politics since the Bush years, quickly. But more importantly, I'm going to tell you why it's been happening and how we got to the circumstances that we're in now and what it is that we can do about it. That's what I'm going to do for my opening remarks tonight. I'm not sure how long it'll take. I'll try to be quick about it, but we'll see. These things are not simple. They say the truth is stranger than fiction. And that is true because the truth is often very complex. And one thing that I see a lot of these days is I'll start to give an analysis, right? I'll start to give an analysis. Oh, John McCarthy and the Uhuru Solidarity Call. You're definitely on the list, John. Thank you. I'll start to give an analysis of events like this. And someone will jump in and be like, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. You didn't mention blah, 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 blah. Well, if it was a math problem and I said 2 + 2 = 4, and you said 2 + 2 = 5, we could have an argument about who's right and who's wrong. But when you're providing analysis of world events, when you're explaining the trajectory of history and how events develop as they do, it's a little bit harder to go, right, no, the correct answer is C, you're wrong. There's many, many factors that make events happen the way they do. And that's important for people to understand. There are many, many factors that make events happen the way they do. And that's why people often will give me historical hypotheticals. Well, Caleb, if we could have gone back in time and prevented the Soviet Union from falling, how would the world have been different? And it's like, I can't answer that question because the Soviet Union falling happened for so many different reasons. And it had so many different results. You ask me, what would the world look like with the Soviet Union having fallen? And I can't tell you because so many things would have had to have been different for the Soviet Union not to have fallen. And then as a result of the Soviet Union not falling, the world would be so completely different. You can't do it. You cannot do it. You can't do it. You just can't do it. So, I'm not here to do historical hypotheticals, but if you really understand the nature of the way the world works, you understand that films like, movies like Back to the Future are just childishness, right? Because, one event is intrinsically tied up to others, as they talk about the butterfly effect, etc. So I'm going to try to give you my understanding of how politics in the United States and around the world has developed since the end of the Bush administration. And I'm going to give it to you from my perspective, what I was doing politically, how I related to these events, right? So when I first got involved in political activism, Bush had been reelected to his second term as president, and a lot of Americans hated George W. Bush. George W. Bush was quite unpopular. His reelection had been a very close vote. People didn't know if he would get reelected or not. Many people feel the election was stolen. There's feeling that there was election theft. Mark Miller, what's his name? The professor. He's a professor who's also a vaccine skeptic. And Mark Crispin Miller, a very famous academic. He kind of moved up the ranks of the progressive circles for kind of digging into how election fraud may have happened in the 2004 election. But regardless, George W. Bush was reelected. It was a close vote, but he was reelected. And after George W. Bush was reelected, the consequences of the Bush administration and their actions started to become more manifest. You have to remember, George W. Bush was a neoconservative, and George W. Bush's administration was the end of the late Cold War normal. You divide the Cold War in the United States into two periods. The McCarthyism, that was the early Cold War, right? We were out to get the commies. We just defeated the Nazis. Now we got to get the commies. The commies are spreading all over the world. We're going to fight communism. We're going to be ultra Christian and conservative because communists are atheists. We're going to be ultra militaristic and love the military because World War II is fresh in our memory. And that was a glorious war where America was clearly on the right side. And we're going to be conservative. And, there was a big, crackdown on gay people after the Second World War also because homosexuality was considered to be communist or considered to be subversive. Big crackdown on pornography. They went after the Roosevelt wing of the Democratic Party and purged them. McCarthyism was a big deal. But then out of McCarthyism, you had the Korean War, which was a devastating war. And then after that, you had the Vietnam War and you had the Civil Rights Movement. And Black people were marching and protesting for their rights. Dr. Martin Luther King was organizing. Malcolm X was popular in northern urban centers among African Americans. There was widespread condemnation of the United States for the Jim Crow segregation system and the racism against Black people. And the Vietnam War was continuing, and the United States was not winning. And the public was not supporting the Vietnam War, and kids on college campuses were burning their draft cards. And about 1968, 1969, 1970, there was a political crisis in America. There was urban rebellions after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The Black Panther Party was growing by leaps and bounds and becoming the symbol of Black liberation. This was a Marxist-Leninist, Black liberation organization. The young people were protesting on the college campuses against the Vietnam War, and were getting arrested, and there were riots, and all of this culminated in a drastic reinvention of the United States. And coming out of the early 1970s, from the presidency of Richard Nixon, really up until the presidency of Jimmy Carter, and finally the ascendancy of Ronald Reagan, you got the solidification of the late Cold War normal in American politics, which was that conservatism was reinvented as the left had been reinvented, right? Before the Cold War, the left had been the politics of class struggle, the picket lines, right? It had been the politics of workers on the job going out on strike and organizing and, populism, being against the rich and powerful. Well, in the 1960s, the left got reinvented. Suddenly, the left was intellectuals who were alienated. They were alienated by militarism and Cold War conformity. They wanted to think for themselves and question authority. People that wanted to use drugs, people that did, were questioning religion or questioning morality. It was, the left became kind of a middle class trend of kind of privileged college kids, intellectuals who, for whatever reason, were alienated from U.S. society, were interested in ideas like communism or anarchism or Buddhism or Eastern mysticism or whatever, because they were alienated from U.S. society. And then the black community had this revolutionary current within it that was being brutally crushed by the government. The black community is overwhelmingly working class, but they had a revolutionary current within the black community that was very nationalist in its orientation and was being brutally crushed by the government. And so the left was kind of reinvented to be middle class and to be, and then you had the Black Liberation Movement, which was separate. And then in response to that, you had the reinvention of conservatism. Conservatism became pseudo-populism. Conservatism felt that the left, leftists, liberals, people that talked about racism, people that opposed the wars, they were all a bunch of intellectual elitist snobs who didn't love the country, didn't love America, were weirdos and used drugs, and they were a bunch of freaks. And so conservatism became the populism of middle-class white Americans, the military, and evangelical conservatives rejecting the counterculture, rejecting the Black Liberation Movement. That became what politics on the Republican side was based on. And Ronald Reagan's presidency was basically the ascendancy of that. Ronald Reagan, he came into office as kind of a blowback to the 1960s counterculture. He said, we're going to love America again. We're going to be proud of America again. It was that, the white middle class rejecting hippie counterculture, rejecting the Black Liberation Movement, the white middle class, the labor aristocracy, working class people that had a higher standard of living because of the stability of U.S. imperialism, who were very loyal to the military, were very loyal to evangelical Christianity and conservatism, and did not like dissidents. They wanted to feel good about America. They wanted to feel good about the country. And that was conservatism. And George W. Bush's presidency was the last neoconservative presidency. George W. Bush was a cowboy. He dressed as a cowboy. Ronald Reagan had actually been an actor who played cowboys in movies. But George W. Bush, even though he was born in Connecticut, and even though his family, the Bush family, are an old money New England Eastern establishment, oil banker, elite family, entrenched power, George W. Bush had lived in Texas. He wore a cowboy hat. They did specials, follow him around with cameras about him cutting brush down on his ranch. And he was for everybody. And he said, no child left behind. We're going to have no child left behind. I'm a compassionate conservative. I love America. George W. Bush. And he was, he put on this, who can forget? He was going to get the armadillos. And he couldn't pronounce the word nuclear. He said nuclear. It's a nuclear bomb. And that was George W. Bush. And, he was quite an unpopular president until 9/11. And after 9/11, they set up amazing photo ops for him. And on the wreckage of 9/11, he was holding a bullhorn, chanting USA, USA. And he was going to go get the terrorists. You're either with us or against us. And Americans were afraid because of the terrorist attack in 9/11, and they were afraid for their lives. And he invaded Iraq. And that was George W. Bush. And the attitude among the conservatives was, if you were against the war in Iraq, why are you disrespecting our troops? Maybe if you have questions about it, that's fine, but you need to shut up out of respect for our troops. I remember that, in high school. I remember I was talking against the war. The principal called me down to the office. He said, we got military families at this school, young man. You need to not talk that way because, they don't, military families, they want to know that their family members are being supported. It was like this idea that because there were people in the military, one could not question the U.S. war in Iraq. And Bush was also opposed to abortion and opposed to gay marriage and Christianity and the military and being a patriotic American. That's what it meant to be a conservative, right? A conservative was one who was in favor of the military, one who was an evangelical Christian, one who thought America was the greatest country in the world. And, that was what it meant to be a conservative. That's neoconservatism. Leo Strauss, one of the intellectuals who developed neoconservatism. He had argued that Americans need to see politics like Gunsmoke, the old cowboy Western TV show, where the good guy wears a white hat, the bad guy wears a black hat. And that's how, George W. Bush literally dressed as a cowboy, and that was American politics. So with those politics, George W. Bush had invaded Iraq, and it was all based on lies, total lies. Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction. That was a lie. Iraq was not involved in 9/11. Even according to the official story, Iraq was a secular Arab nationalist government, whereas, Osama bin Laden was a Saudi and a Wahhabi Islamic fundamentalist. The USA, Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. Iraq was not developing weapons of mass destruction, and Europe was against it. Britain was the only major European country that was siding with the United States. France was against it. Germany was against it. Italy was against it. All the major NATO countries were against the invasion of Iraq. The USA did it anyway. The UN Security Council told them they couldn't do it. They did it anyway. The USA invaded Iraq, and it killed hundreds of thousands of people. The attack on Baghdad was called shock and awe, and they just blew Iraq to shreds. And they murdered hundreds of thousands of people. It was a brutal crime against humanity. And, I was a high school student, and I could see that this was a crime against humanity. And I was surrounded by people that were big supporters of it. And I was we had to make candy every morning for the troops. Our school adopted a battleship, and we had to write letters to the troops and make candy, things to send to the troops. And, I was constantly being dragged to patriotic ceremonies, and I didn't agree with the war in Iraq. So part of my development as a communist was I started reading about the war in Iraq and opposing it, and reading what the communists who were involved in protesting it had to say. George W. Bush was reelected in 2004. And after he was reelected, the U.S. occupation of Iraq had a very serious consequence, which was that it drove the oil prices through the roof. Oil was $120 a barrel, some of the highest oil prices in the history of petroleum at that point. Oil prices went through the roof. And that had the result of strengthening Venezuela. In Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, the socialist leader, the USA tried to remove him in a coup in 2002 and failed. And he was back in power. And Venezuela has lots of oil. And when George W. Bush drove those oil prices through the roof by blowing up Iraq, that made Venezuela very strong. And Venezuela started offering funding to different communist and socialist movements across Latin America. Evo Morales got elected in Bolivia in 2006. The Sandinistas came back to power in Nicaragua in 2006. Rafael Correa, a socialist, took power in Ecuador. And all over the continent, there were massive, socialist and Marxist movements in Latin America, partially because Europe was angry at the United States for invading Iraq. You'll remember that, when Bush invaded Iraq, there was they started calling French fries freedom fries because France had disrespected America by not supporting the invasion. And in Congress, they started calling French fries at the congressional cafeteria freedom fries, and Germany had opposed it. And because of that, Europe, the European NATO countries were not fighting the expansion of socialism in Latin America like they are now, because they figured, hey, the USA, by invading Iraq, is being hostile to us. And there was a divide, you have to remember, between Iraq and Iran. And France and Germany had been more sympathetic to Iraq because they thought Iran was the main danger. Whereas the United States at the time had been kind of starting to be friendlier to Iran and thought Iraq was the main danger. And, France had helped Iraq to develop its peaceful nuclear energy program. And then Israel had murdered a French citizen in Iraq by bombing the Iraq nuclear power plants in the early 1980s. And so there's a whole history of the European mainland, didn't approve of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And in a lot of ways, it was kind of an attack on the European rival imperialists, in addition to being an attack on Iraq, which was an anti-imperialist country. So that was important to keep in mind. So Bolivarian socialism was expanding in Latin America. Around the same time, you'll remember there was Hurricane Katrina, 2005. There was a hurricane. Hurricane Katrina happened. And basically thousands and thousands of black people living in New Orleans were left on their rooftops to die. The whole city was flooded, and people were drowned. And then the black people who were still staying in the city, they were basically forced. They were rounded up in this sports stadium, the Superdome, where the National Guard treated them as prisoners. And there were thousands of black people in a sports stadium in the United States that were being treated as prisoners with armed guards surrounding them. And, there were testimony of, people being shot if they tried to leave. And it was, people described the conditions in the Superdome, in New Orleans, where black people were just kind of being rounded up. They described them almost like a concentration camp. And it was just, all the black people of New Orleans who needed help after the city was flooded, they were left there. They couldn't get out in time. So they got flooded. They were treated as criminals. And it was genocidal almost, it was really, really criminal what was done. And the lower Ninth Ward of New Orleans was just totally flooded. And the black people were held in a stadium and subjected to concentration camp like conditions. It was really, really horrendous. And the black community was furious about it. There was widespread anger. Kanye West had his great moment on American television in those years. And he famously said, George Bush doesn't care about black people. He said that on national television, and the whole country was applauding for him. Many people were applauding for him for saying that. And there was widespread anger at George W. Bush in the black community. The next year, you had the anniversary of the Million Man March. You had the Millions More March that happened. And in 2006, just months after Hurricane Katrina, and Minister Louis Farrakhan had 100,000 people out on the National Mall. He gave a speech quoting Mao Zedong in the Little Red Book. Minister Louis Farrakhan said that the United States needs to model itself on Cuba, a country that cares for its poor. The Democrats talk about the middle class. The Republicans talk about the middle class, but no one talks about the poor. And Minister Louis Farrakhan, who is tied to Iran, goes to Iran frequently, and is tied to Cuba, and is tied to China, North Korea, and is an anti-imperialist. He had this huge anti-imperialist rally on the National Mall. And at that anti-imperialist rally, the Cuban government, they had a representative who spoke and gave a recorded message. The speaker of the Cuban parliament spoke to that rally. And, Gaddafi sent a message of support to that rally. And that Minister Louis Farrakhan kind of stepped up to the plate. In the Nation of Islam, because they're a well-entrenched black nationalist organization, and they had done the Million Man March in the 90s, they did this Millions More March shortly after Hurricane Katrina. And there was, thousands and thousands, 100,000 people on the National Mall. And it seemed like a communist rally. It wasn't communist technically, it was black nationalist. But they were quoting Mao, they were quoting Che Guevara. They had great black leaders, and they had a slideshow of great black leaders, and it was communist after communist, included Che Guevara, which I didn't know Che Guevara was black. I thought Che Guevara was Latin, but regardless, they had Che Guevara on there as a great black revolutionary leader, and and Fred Hampton, and it was there was an explosion of revolutionary sentiments among the black community. The black community was angry. The oil prices had shot through the roof. So then you'll recall that that Israel attacked Lebanon. And Lebanon was, Lebanon is a country where there's an organization called Hezbollah. And Hezbollah, right? Hezbollah is, funded by Iran. It is a revolutionary, anti-imperialist Islamic organization. And Israel invaded Lebanon, and Israel got its ass kicked by Hezbollah. And the whole Muslim world was cheering for Hezbollah. And, Hezbollah just destroyed the Israeli invaders. And it's wild. The wild things happened in that war. For example, Israel broadcast porn all over the televisions in Lebanon. They hacked the TVs and were broadcasting porn because they assumed that the population were conservative, and that they would be so titillated by the porn. They wouldn't go out and fight them. It didn't work, obviously. They did all kinds of weird stuff like that. But Israel was defeated. And when they rebuilt Lebanon, when Hezbollah started rebuilding Lebanon, they were building, statues of Hugo Chavez. They were building statues of Che Guevara. They were building statues of Fidel Castro. And, Hezbollah is, historically an anti-communist Islamic organization, but they were sounding pretty Marxist and socialist as well. And that, Iran had fought with Iraq, but Iran had been named as the axis of evil by George W. Bush, and the oil prices had shot up. And so the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the state sector of the Iranian economy and the hardliners of Iran were surging in popularity. And Ahmadinejad was president of Iran, and he condemned capitalism. And he said that Fidel Castro was a great Muslim, and that Iran started shifting in this like revolutionary direction. And Iran started identifying itself with the Islamic, with the movement of the Bolivarian socialist countries of Latin America. And on top of that, Russia, Putin had come into power in 1999. He'd gotten elected, and he'd started restructuring Russia's economy around state-run oil and gas. And so when George W. Bush shot the oil prices through the roof, that resulted in Russia regaining its strength. And then you'll recall that in 2008, just as Bush was on his way out, as the 2008 election was happening, Georgia, which is a U.S.-aligned government, attacked South Ossetia, which is a territory that is aligned with Russia, that's separated. It's a separatist movement, a territory that considers itself to not be part of Georgia, that's aligned with Russia. And Georgia attacked South Ossetia. And so in response, Russia retaliated. It protected the people of South Ossetia, and it retaliated. And so the U.S. media was suddenly condemning Russia for invading Georgia, attacking Georgia, and suddenly we were hearing that Putin was a dictator, and U.S. media had been kind of confused. They weren't exactly clear about their position on Putin. But then 2008, they started telling us that that Putin was a dictator, that he'd invaded Georgia. It was very wild. So that was a moment where, it seemed like the ruling class of the United States was turning against Bush, not because of the fact that, he'd invaded Iraq and killed all these innocent people, not because of the fact that the civil liberties of the United States were being stripped away, the Patriot Act, and, Guantanamo Bay, people were being held without charges. And, it wasn't because of that. It was because around the world, anti-imperialist forces were gaining a lot of strength because of what Bush had done, right? Because Europe, the European mainland, France and Germany were not solidly with Britain and America. They were not solidly on board with fighting Venezuela, fighting Iran, etc. And then on top of that, the icing on the cake was the oil prices going through the roof. So Venezuela, Libya under Gaddafi was rising. Gaddafi became the president of the African Union, and Gaddafi, the Libyan economy was booming. Angola experienced a huge amount of economic expansion. Isabel dos Santos was running the state-run oil company of Angola. And, Russia was rising, and that Bush shooting up the oil prices and alienating Europe had strengthened the global forces of anti-imperialism. And so 2006, Bush and the Republicans lost control of the House and Senate. And it was very clear that U.S. media was starting to turn against the Republicans. But what was weird was that their objections to the Republicans were all weird. They were weird objections. They claimed the Republicans weren't inspecting ships in American harbors enough. That was one of the arguments. Another one of the arguments was that they talked about how, Dick Cheney's wife, Lynn Cheney, had written a lesbian porn novel, right? And that was revealed that Dick Cheney's wife was a lesbian, and that Dick Cheney's daughter was openly a lesbian, was married to another woman. But then, Dick Cheney's wife, Lynn Cheney, had written like lesbian porn and, this lesbian porn novel or something, which was very odd. And it was like they were finding things to attack the Republicans over, but not attack them over things like the war, etc. And things were starting to shift. So then, right, as we're getting ready for the 2008 election, Barack Obama is being hailed as the savior. Right? Barack Obama is practically unheard of in American politics. He's a local politician from Chicago. He was in the Senate. He gave a very mild and strangely worded anti-war speech at one point. And previously unknown, his father was from Kenya. His background, he'd lived in Hawaii. It was like his whole background was very strange and all of this. And out of nowhere, Barack Obama is just being hailed as the savior in American media, right? And during his campaign, Barack Obama flies to Berlin, Germany, and speaks to like hundreds of thousands of Germans in Berlin. And it's like, why is he doing that? Germans can't vote in the U.S. election. Well, it's very clear that Obama is trying to win the support of Europe and say that he will patch things up with the NATO countries. That's what he's saying. And so at that point, Obama is being hailed as the savior, and the cult of personality around Obama was very extreme. They amped up all of their advertising and their mind control stuff, and it was pretty nuts. I was at a college in those years that was very, very white, very middle class. And, Obama was wildly popular, even though there was a lot of conservatives on the campus. And if you disagreed with Obama, you were, it was like you hurt people's feelings. They just had this like loyalty to him. He was their savior. He was saying, yes, we can. Yes, we can, and he was going to bring change you can believe in, hope and change. And it was like, nothing specific, he was against gay marriage. He was going to continue the U.S. war in Iraq. He was going to keep the troops there. It was weird, but there was a huge cult of personality around Obama. And then right before the U.S. election, right before the 2008 election, the U.S. economy crashed, and you had the Wall Street crash. The Wall Street banks just started failing one after another. Well, what was that about? Well, it was about the fact that Americans couldn't continue spending as they once had. The living standards of Americans were going down. Americans couldn't afford to keep buying houses as they'd once been able to. And on top of that, a lot of Americans were tricked into getting second mortgages on their houses so they could pay their bills, right? The jobs and the living standards were decreasing. The rate of household debt was rising. Student debt was crushing the economy. Wages were going down. And all throughout the country, there started to be a home foreclosure crisis as Americans lost their homes because they couldn't afford to pay their second mortgage or their first mortgage, right? And, banks were getting homes, and this is what they called the housing bubble burst, right? The government had facilitated all these housing loans, and all these housing loans were not being paid back. And so the government was paying the banks, and one thing led to another. And Wall Street banks started collapsing because the housing bubble burst. And the real issue was that Americans had been unable to keep buying houses as they once had. So Alan Greenspan had legalized all kinds of credit card and housing lending practices to keep Americans spending money. They needed the population to keep spending money in order to keep the economy going, but living standards were decreasing. The problem of overproduction. The fact that the worker is not paid back enough to buy what he produces, the tendency of the falling rate of profit, the computer revolution, all of this was leading to a situation where the U.S. economy had a big crash. And of course, the economy crashed. People blamed George W. Bush. People blamed Alan Greenspan for his, legalizing of all these easy credit things. The real problem was just the decline in living standards. Americans' living standards and incomes were dropping. That was the issue. But they blamed it on Bush's policies, and Obama rode into the White House as a savior on a white horse. And what really happened was that the Brzezinski faction that had been kind of dethroned by Ronald Reagan was back in power. Barack Obama had studied at Columbia University under Zbigniew Brzezinski. He'd studied at the Columbia University International School, which is one of the main CIA's places. That's the school that Brzezinski built. And that the Eastern establishment, the soft power, ultra rich, were back into power. And they were back in power, and they wanted to stabilize the economy. And they had the Affordable Care Act, and they had Dodd-Frank, the Wall Street regulations. They had a few other laws, and they wanted to stabilize the economy. And Barack Obama, the CIA rode in, and Barack Obama the CIA. I mean, you can read Wayne Madsen wrote a very good book about Barack Obama and his background. Barack Obama was in with that Eastern establishment, Zbigniew Brzezinski, liberal CIA faction. And he rode into power to patch things up with Europe and to try and stabilize the U.S. economy. And part of the way that Barack Obama was able to generate such a huge cult of personality was with this invention called Facebook. Facebook was a new invention at that time. You had to have a college email address to use Facebook. If your email address didn't end in .edu, you couldn't even use Facebook. It was only for college students. MySpace had been around, but MySpace was being usurped by Facebook and Twitter. And Facebook and Twitter were these new inventions. And the Democrats and Barack Obama had the upper hand. The Facebook and Twitter were for the Democrats, and they were for Barack Obama. And we started to see the rise of, this is the beginning of the SJW culture. People started talking about white privilege. People started talking about white privilege and mansplaining. And, it was kind of the beginning of that. And Barack Obama was quite popular on Facebook, and the mainstream media outlets were still somewhat conservative, but Facebook and Twitter and then to top it all off, you had the new atheist movement. And this came out of nowhere, right? Barack Obama was president. And as Barack Obama was president, suddenly it became okay to be an atheist, right? And Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, and suddenly atheism was everywhere. And it wasn't old school atheism. Atheism, the word atheist comes out of the French Revolution, and it just means without God. God is theism is belief in God. So atheism is belief without God, belief that there is no God, right? That's atheism. Well, atheism had always been associated with communism because of the fact that it came out of the French Revolution, because the Soviet Union had been an atheist country, because Marx was an atheist, because dialectical materialism generally rejects any sense of religion. And so atheism had been associated with the left and communists, and right-wing conservatives had always been very firm Bible believers. And we don't want those communists who don't believe in God, blah, 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 blah. Well, things changed, right? And so now you had Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins, he has a British accent. So he must be intelligent because his accent is British. Stupid people don't speak with really smart British accents. I'm just joking, of course, but Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and Christopher Hitchens, and suddenly, but these guys were not communists, and in fact, they hated Muslims. They would often argue that Muslims were the most dangerous religion. They were big supporters of Israel because they saw Israel as a secular outpost against Muslims. They were big supporters of U.S. foreign policy, and they would often they would say communism was a religion. They would compare North Korea to a religious state because it worships its leader, because they believe in their ideology. And the new atheists were everywhere. And what the new atheists were there to do is they were giving a punch in the mouth to the evangelical Christian right, the neocons, right? The neoconservatives, a big part of them had been this evangelical stuff. And with social media and with the rise of the new atheists, suddenly evangelical Christianity lost a lot of its power. When I was growing up, almost everyone I grew up around was an evangelical because that's all they knew, right? They were in a small town. They grew up. They went to an evangelical church. They went to a public school, but we were taught creationism in the public school. And, everyone they knew was an evangelical, and they went to an evangelical daycare, and they went to an evangelical church on Sunday. It wasn't like that anymore. Now, all of a sudden, with your phone or with your computer, you could have access to all kinds of non-religious or religious skeptical ideas. And so many Americans that had been evangelicals or deeply religious were becoming new atheists. A lot of young men, too. A lot of young men, that was kind of their expression of being a teenager, right, during those years, was that they, their family was evangelical, but they got on their computer and they learned that the Bible is not literally true. And so they felt smarter than their family. And the religious evangelical Christian right got a big punch in the mouth during these years. And that was the Eastern establishment, right? That was Brzezinski. That was the big oil monopolists trying to get control, because George W. Bush and the neocons, They had used the word crusade to describe the war on terror and alienated so many, Muslims around the world. Barack Obama was trying to win back the Muslims of the world to support the United States. I often talk about how Barack Obama was a modern day Napoleon. Barack Obama was not a Muslim. He was not a Muslim at all, right? He was married in a church. His pastor was Jeremiah Wright. However, his middle name was Hussein. He had gone to a Muslim school when he was a kid in Indonesia, and he'd lived in a Muslim country. He'd had a Muslim stepfather, Lolo Sutaro, who was a leader of the Indonesian military. His father was from Kenya, and his father was a Muslim. So Barack Obama was not a Muslim, but the right wing and the conservatives were always calling him a Muslim. And that worked in the Middle East. In the Middle East, many people believed he would be better on Palestine. And they believed he would listen to the Arab people because of this. And this is what Napoleon did. When Napoleon conquered Egypt and Syria, he put up posters everywhere claiming that he believed in the Prophet Muhammad, that he was a Muslim, to try to get the people of Syria and Egypt to support him against the British Empire. Napoleon had this poster that his soldiers distributed. They put up all over Egypt and all over Syria. The headline was, "I come to restore your rights," written in Arabic. And it was a psyop. It was a psychological warfare operation for Napoleon to say he was a Muslim. Well, Barack Obama never said he was a Muslim, but, it was implied that he was a Muslim. And that is how the Arab Spring was so effective. Remember, 2011, the economic crisis in the United States is still going on, mass unemployment. But in the Arab world, the economic crisis is very extreme. So using Facebook and using Twitter, in Tunisia, there was a guy who lost his job, or he lost his license to sell fruit or something. So he poured gasoline on himself and lit himself on fire. Now, I don't know how that wasn't a violation of Facebook's terms of service, Twitter's terms of service, but somehow this went viral. This guy pouring gasoline all over himself and lighting himself on fire. And it went viral. Not an accident by any means. And all over Tunisia, everyone on their phones and on their computers saw that this guy had lit himself on fire. Conditions were so bad, and it was time to go out and protest. And so there was a huge protest in Tunisia, and the long-standing leader, Ben Ali, was ousted, right? The military leader who was kind of a puppet of the United States. But, there was a streak of independence. Ben Ali was ousted by a social media campaign. And then in Egypt, right? Hosni Mubarak, the military dictator, he was ousted in a similar way. There were widespread protests all over Egypt. And there were a lot of desperately poor people who lost their jobs. And the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a wing of the global, Islamic religion. All right, I'll speak about that later. You're on the list. Which was a wing of the global Muslim religion, and was sympathetic, had a long history of working with the CIA, around the world. They tried to overthrow Assad. They tried to kill, the leader of Arab socialism in Egypt, Abdel Nasser. And, the Muslim Brotherhood was very good at mobilizing poor people to be part of the Arab Spring protests. The Muslim Brotherhood, they're a wing of the global Muslim community. That they admire the West. They say things like America is more Islamic than the Muslim world. They believe in capitalism and free trade. They reject Arab nationalism. They're very anti-communist. And the Muslim Brotherhood was a big part of it. Al Jazeera, which was the TV network based in Qatar, which is aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood, they were a big part of making the Arab Spring happen. And Facebook and Twitter in Silicon Valley engineered violent uprisings all over the Middle East. It was a controlled release. There was a lot of anger because of the economy, and it was predicted by many geopolitical analysts that there was going to be a widespread series of uprisings in the Middle East. And I remember John Conyers. I was a member of the Workers' World Party. I was in Detroit in the summer of 2008. John Conyers came and talked to a local meeting of the peace groups. This was a member of Congress. And he said to us, it's not just here in America people are unemployed. All over the world, people are unemployed and they're hungry, and in a lot of countries, they're run by, they're living under dictators. and dictators that have been backed by America. And, a lot of these unemployed young men across the Muslim world, they're going to revolt, and it's important that we have a president like Barack Obama, so that when these young men across the Arab world, they revolt, that there's a guy in the White House who can relate to them, right? So basically, John Conyers, member of Congress, was telling us, that the Arab Spring was being planned. I mean, I look back on that now, and he was basically that Barack Obama was put into the White House so they could have someone who could help control the explosion that was coming in the Arab world. Because what American intelligence feared was that the Arab Spring would turn into an explosion of anti-imperialism. And they saw how Israel had been devastated, destroyed by Hezbollah when they invaded Lebanon, how Iran was an anti-imperialist country. They had overthrown a US-backed dictator and established an anti-imperialist government. And there was a fear that in light of the economic crisis, that, there would be events like the Islamic Revolution of Iran that would spread all over the Middle East, all over North Africa. They didn't want that. So Barack Obama was put into office to be the public relations man for the United States, so that when this revolt happened, they could manipulate it. And this is what you have to remember. They basically made these revolts happen with social media. The revolts were going to happen one way or another, but it's almost like, imagine there's an old building, that's got flammable material in it. It's going to burn anyway. So you go over and you light the match and you figure, let's burn it now. The explosion was going to happen. It was like a controlled release. And they said, let's get ahead of it. Let's make the revolution happen on our terms. Let's control it with Facebook. Let's control it with Twitter. And if you read what Anne Marie Slaughter wrote, Anne Marie Slaughter was in the Hillary Clinton State Department. She was basically, that was their strategy, was let's make the revolution happen ahead of time so we control it. And that was the Obama administration's strategy. And Hillary Clinton was running it all through her State Department. Barack Obama was the president, and he didn't even know what was going on. Jared Andrew Cohen was in the Hillary Clinton State Department, and he was also on the board of Google Alphabet. And he served as the liaison between Silicon Valley and the U.S. State Department. And he actually went to Twitter and gave them instructions about how to manipulate Twitter in order to cause unrest in Iran without asking Barack Obama. And Barack Obama wanted him fired. He said, you went with the authority of the White House to Twitter and told them to manipulate things to help protests in Iran without asking me. You're fired. And Hillary Clinton stopped Barack Obama from firing Jared Andrew Cohen. We now know this. This came out at the end of Obama's presidency. Hillary Clinton was running the Arab Spring. Barack Obama was, he was the stooge, on TV. He didn't even know what was going on, right? I mean, he was being manipulated, right? And Hillary Clinton and Jared Andrew Cohen and, Anne Marie Slaughter and Samantha Power, they were behind the scenes manipulating everything, right? And that this was the Eastern establishment. This was Brzezinski, and this was the Color Revolution faction. And they were trying, they wanted the revolution that happened as a result of the economic crisis, as a result of the problems in the Middle East. They wanted to have it happen on their terms. And they did a very good job of it. And they were able to destabilize Libya and overthrow Libya. And Barack Obama didn't want to send missiles. And Samantha Power and there's, Ben Gate, what is his name? Ben Rhodes, they brag about how they worked on Barack Obama for 3 days to convince him to bomb Libya and destroy Libya. And he didn't want to be Bush. He didn't want to invade a country, but they worked on him for 3 days. They told him that Gaddafi had said he was going to go house to house. That meant he was going to slaughter everyone in Benghazi. And they manipulated Barack Obama into destroying Libya. And Barack Obama said that was the biggest mistake of his presidency, was when he listened to Hillary Clinton, he listened to Samantha Power, he listened to Ben Rhodes, and he invaded Libya, and he toppled the Libyan government. But they knew how to manipulate him, and Barack Obama was not really in power, right? The Hillary Clinton State Department was running things. That was very, very clear. They overthrew the Libyan government. They started the Libyan civil war, right? And they caused a lot of chaos, and a lot of people in the U.S. military were freaking out, because they knew that in all these countries where the Arab Spring was happening, governments that had held back Al-Qaeda like Libya. Libya had offered to torture al-Qaeda for the United States. Gaddafi wiped out al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda had no presence in Libya. But after the overthrow of Gaddafi, in Libya, al-Qaeda was growing by leaps and bounds. And in Syria, you had al-Qaeda and al-Nusra, and eventually ISIS emerges out of all this chaos. And that, actual terrorist groups that do actually kill people and do torture people, they were gaining strength, while Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were overthrowing anti-imperialist governments. In Libya and in Syria, you had two anti-imperialist governments, and they were able to manipulate the energy of the Arab Spring to overthrow them. And the Muslim Brotherhood was recruiting people off the streets of these countries and sending them to Syria to fight against Assad and sending them to Libya to fight against Gaddafi, recruiting child soldiers. It was like, and the Muslim Brotherhood was a very effective tool for the United States in setting up civil war in Libya and Syria. And this was all engineered, right? But you'll notice that in Syria, they weren't able to pull it off. Russia came in and defended Syria. Meanwhile, the terrorist attacks in the Western countries were getting worse. ISIS emerged, the horrendous attack in France. One of the Libyans who was paid by American British intelligence to fight Gaddafi went back to Manchester. What did he do? He blew up the concert and he killed a bunch of people. This is a guy the USA had armed to fight against Gaddafi, right? The Manchester bomber, look it up. He was an anti-Gaddafi fighter paid by the United States. The Tsarnaev brothers, their parents had been Chechen separatists who had fought against Russia. And all over the United States, these people, these terrorist networks, the U.S. government is bribing them with visas, right? Bribing them with visas, saying, if you go and fight, against Gaddafi, you go and fight Assad, we'll give your wife and kids a visa and you can come to the United States. And many of those people, because they have this violent extremist ideology, because they've been trained to be killers, these are counter gangs set up by U.S. imperialism. Fundamentalist Islamic counter gangs set up by U.S. imperialism, where they brainwash these people to be suicide bombers, to be killers. Well, you take those people and you take them back to the United States, and they see naked women on billboards, and they see, porn everywhere, and they see our very liberal secular society, and they have a meltdown, and then they go and shoot a bunch of people, or they blow something up, or they blow up the Boston Marathon, or they, or they attack the Manchester concert because the singer is naked or whatever. I mean, it's if you look at what happened, right, that the U.S. government under Obama and under Hillary Clinton had just amped up its support for terrorists, right? And the Saudis, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and the Muslim Brotherhood were handing out weapons and just pouring a lot of support into these terrorist networks. And these terrorist networks were training people to be literally insane, and they were then attacking the United States. And there were many people within the deep state who weren't happy about that. Among them, Tulsi Gabbard. Among them, General Michael Flynn. You remember General Michael Flynn? Who started saying we need to cooperate with Russia. And Russia, has been fighting against Islamic separatists for a really long time. The USA has tried to use Muslims to fight against Russia. So often Russia was going to the American government with information. The Russians brought information about the Tsarnaev brothers, the guy who bombed the Boston Marathon. Russia had brought information. They said, look, these guys are crazy. You watch those Tsarnaev brothers. We've been monitoring them. They're involved with this Chechen separatist network. They're dangerous. The U.S. government ignored it, and then they bombed the Boston concert, right? The Pulse nightclub shooter, the guy, Omar Mateen, who shot up the Pulse nightclub. You remember this guy, right? Well, his father had been an American intelligence asset in Afghanistan. Who ran a program that was broadcast into Afghanistan, had been opposed to the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, was a wealthy, powerful Afghan whose son clearly had, mental problems. And his son had gone around, he'd been, here in New York City, he'd gone to a mosque, and the other people at the mosque turned him in to the government. They said, this guy's dangerous. He's a terrorist, right? In many places he would go. He lost jobs because he threatened his coworkers. This guy, everywhere he went, people were calling the FBI. This guy's crazy. This guy's violent. But his dad was powerful. And he was on the terrorism watch list, and then they took him off of it because his dad was a CIA asset. Omar Mateen's father was a longtime U.S. ally in Afghanistan, so they didn't touch him. And then Omar Mateen finally had his meltdown and shot up the Pulse nightclub and killed a bunch of people at the Pulse nightclub in Florida. You remember this, right? So this is happening, right? This is happening. Meanwhile, they're unable to overthrow the Syrian government. The economy is not getting any better. And you have the rise of opioids, right? The opioid crisis is just devastating middle America, right? And as a result of neoconservatism being on the out, there's a rise of libertarianism among conservatives. There's a rise, Alex Jones is becoming more popular. And because the Obama administration's policies had strengthened terrorism around the world, no question about it, because Obama's policies had not really stabilized the U.S. economy, and because there was a rising layer of working class people in red states and in low income rural areas who were getting into Alex Jones, had seen opioids devastate their communities, they were angry. We had the rise of Donald Trump, and Donald Trump was brought in to be the savior for the increasing layer of dissent among the white working class. Donald Trump was in there, and we're going to make America great again. That's what we're going to do. Yeah, I'm going to build a huge wall. I'm going to block these immigrants from coming in with their drugs and their crime. Donald Trump came in kind of similar to how Barack Obama came in. When Barack Obama came in, the U.S. economy had just crashed. The U.S. foreign policy had had a lot of blowback. And Barack Obama came in to reassure the black community that they were being heard, to calm the unrest among the black community. And Barack Obama came in to, tell the Muslim world and to play the sinister role he played during the Arab Spring. Well, Donald Trump came into office because he was trying to play a similar role for the military, for the sections of the FBI and the military and the deep state who were angry about U.S. foreign policy. And these are the people that's job it is to prevent terrorist attacks. And they're seeing Obama basically doing everything he can to help terrorists around the world. And for that white working class, those people that feel like no one cares about them, that see the opioids devastating their communities, and to be fair, and this has to be acknowledged, is that during Obama's presidency there was a rise of anti-racism. Black Lives Matter was a widespread uprising against the police state. And it was because Barack Obama had come into office, promised, the black community thought he would hear them on the issue of police brutality. They thought, finally, we have a black president. And police brutality got worse. It got worse. It objectively got worse because of the economic conditions, right? As the economy gets worse, the police state amplifies. When people are hungry and struggling, that's when they set up a police state to try and control the population. And the police state got worse. Now, it got worse for everybody. Obviously, for the black community that's been suffering from police brutality for years and years, it was the worst for them because they've been facing it for so long, and it was amped up, and they were the main targets of mass incarceration. But it got worse for everybody too. There were no-knock raids, in rural areas. Increasingly, they would think that some farmer somewhere, they'd think that maybe he was growing, marijuana on his farm. Well, he wasn't, right? But they have a warrant. And so they go to his house. They don't even knock on the door. They kick the door open, right? And he doesn't know who they are. And he's got a gun. And he sees that someone just kicked his door open and they've got a gun. So he takes his gun and he shoots them and they shoot back. And that was happening. Read about the no-knock raids that law enforcement was doing all over the country. Many innocent people got killed in no-knock raids because the SWAT team kicked down their door and didn't knock first. And they didn't know who it was. And so they shot, like anyone would do, any gun-owning citizen. If someone kicks down your door in the middle of the night and points a gun in your face and they don't know what's going on, they pull their gun out and they shoot back. And police brutality was getting worse. And so you had the rise of Black Lives Matter. And, of course, the last thing that the ruling class ever wants is there to be a widespread working class movement. So immediately, right, they start trying to divert Black Lives Matter away from being an uprising against the police state, because the white community is mad about the police state as well. There's a huge rise of anger at the police state among white Americans, right? The libertarian Alex Jones community, the no-knock raids, etc. But they make it about white privilege, right? And so there's a section of the white community that feels like, oh, our conditions are getting worse and no one cares about us, right? They only care about what black people are going through. And that's a really common sentiment among low-income white workers, right? Is that when they hear people talk about racism, they feel like it's an attack on them. They feel like it's like saying that their suffering isn't discounted. Now, the class line, the Marxist class line, is that we take the line that all workers are oppressed by capitalism, and all the state, the ruling class, and their police state is an enemy of all people. But it is worse for black people. But by aligning with black people, white workers can find their liberation. That's the class line. But Black Lives Matter did not push the class line. Black Lives Matter did not push the class line. And in fact, one of the memes that they were posting in social media was that there was at something called Pumpkin Fest. There had been a drunken riot, I guess, at Pumpkin Fest, where, you know, some low-income white people had been drunk and there'd been scuffles with the police. And there had been the rioting in Ferguson. And the way they framed it was like the police should be beating up, you know, the white workers at Pumpkin Fest. Also, I sat through these kind of woke lectures where the emphasis was never on the police state being a threat to all Americans. The emphasis was never on black and white unite and fight. The emphasis was always on white people have it too good, condemn them, you know, they're bad, right? And that the good white people are the wealthy, middle-class white people who go to anti-racist trainings, right? And this was brilliant on the part of the ruling class. And so the low-income white working class felt that Black Lives Matter was an attack on them, which it was not. But the ruling class was able to frame things in a way that the white working class felt that Black Lives Matter was an attack on them. So Donald Trump came in and he said, oh, there's no respect for law enforcement. Blue lives matter. I love the police, you know, and many low-income white workers who felt attacked by Black Lives Matter because the ruling class had manipulated it to be about privilege politics, not class solidarity, not Marxist anti-racism. That was how Donald Trump was able to capitalize on that. So Donald Trump came into office, and it was very clear that Donald Trump's presidency was a coalition. There were some neoconservatives from the Bush years who were willing to work with Trump because they hated Obama. They thought Obama, you know, was too soft. Obama had worked with Europe, had not been willing enough for the United States to go it alone. So John Bolton, people like that, they were willing to tolerate Donald Trump, and they liked that Trump was very hostile to the Islamic Republic of Iran, that he was very pro-Israel and very anti-Venezuela. But there was also another wing of the deep state that was friendly to Donald Trump. That was Michael Flynn, who he made, you know, had as his national security advisor. You know, that was Steve Bannon, who is, you know, a Pentagon guy, military industrial complex guy, you know, and has been fooling around with economic nationalism and various Bonapartist kind of politics. Tulsi Gabbard went and met with Donald Trump a number of times as president and tried to persuade him to oppose regime change wars. And that it was very clear that there was kind of a dual nature to the Trump administration. On the one hand, Trump was toying with economic nationalism and non-interventionism. On the other hand, he was pandering very hard to a particular wing of the neoconservatives that is obsessed with Iran because they are loyal to Israel, and is obsessed with Venezuela because they are anti-Cuba and anti-Latin. They focused on Latin America, right? Elliot Abrams is one of these people, right? And so Donald Trump is trying to keep both sides of these folks happy throughout his presidency. And Donald Trump's economic policies are roughly the same as George W. Bush's, right? Deregulation. He just rolled back. He lifted restrictions on deep sea drilling. He rolled back various government programs. He deregulated Wall Street. He lowered the tax rate. Trump's policies were basically the same economic policies as Bush, but he talked like a populist, right? He would talk about the rich. He would say maybe we could cancel student debt, but he never did anything about it, right? Donald Trump toyed with populist language, and then he went back and forth. You know, they were escalating with Venezuela very hard at one point, right? And at one point, Donald Trump just said he was bored with it. He was bored. He didn't want to do it. Then Donald Trump murdered Qasem Soleimani, right? Who was he pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. He moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, and then he murdered Qasem Soleimani, who's the national hero of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And Iran retaliated very effectively, right? The response that Iran gave militarily, they tried to downplay it. At first, they said there were no injuries. And then we found out later that was a lie, that a number of U.S. soldiers were injured, and that Iran had very carefully circled the base demonstrating that if they wanted to actually destroy and kill every soldier in this base, they could, but they didn't because they didn't want to spark World War III. But Iran retaliated very effectively with their missiles. I mean, they targeted some U.S. bases and very effectively retaliated. And the day after, you'll notice Donald Trump, he walked out, and a lot of the generals were furious, and Donald Trump looked like he'd seen a ghost because they had shown him in the back room that by killing Qasem Soleimani, he had almost started World War III. Right? He was on the brink of starting World War III. If Iran had retaliated and then he'd retaliated and directly attacked, Iran, Russia would have defended Iran, China would have defended Iran, and U.S. and Israel, and he almost started World War III. And you'll remember that press conference that Donald Trump had. He walked out and it was like the generals were all very angry, and Donald Trump had almost started World War III. And it was very clear that, that was a really risky move that Donald Trump had taken. And if the roll of the dice had gone differently, nukes would have gone off within 48 hours. It was a very disgusting, cowardly act that Donald Trump had engaged in. Qasem Soleimani had been lured to Iraq for negotiations. As he was on his way to the airport, from negotiations, they hit his car with a drone. It was a cowardly act, a cowardly attack, and it almost sparked World War III. And it isolated, a lot of the NATO countries didn't agree with it. The Atlantic Council didn't agree with it. It was a devastating move. And it also, at that point, it became clear the hardliners, the reformist movement in Iran that was pro, Western, they were out of power. The hardliners were back in power in Iran forever. The reformists will never have power in Iran again for a long time. Because at this point, the hardliners, they said, don't trust America, don't negotiate with America. And they were right. They were absolutely right. And so it appears that, Donald Trump's presidency, in a lot of ways, they felt they just couldn't trust him in terms of foreign policy. You'll remember there was a general who resigned who basically said that Donald Trump didn't agree with him about how important it was to oppose Russia and China. Essentially Donald Trump, they couldn't trust him on foreign policy. And then we remember this thing called the pandemic, right? And the pandemic happened, and we vaccines and lockdowns and aside, and the pandemic, the suicide rate, it killed a lot of people, right? It killed a lot of people, the lockdowns, and put all of that aside for now. One thing that I must point out, and I pointed this out at the time, Donald Trump is not a fascist, because if Donald Trump had been a fascist, the pandemic would have been his Reichstag fire. If Donald Trump had been a fascist, he would have used the pandemic to deport every immigrant. He would have used the pandemic to, arrest people for not wearing masks. He would have, if Donald Trump were actually a fascist, right, he would have made the pandemic work for him. But he didn't. In fact, the pandemic was used against him. The pandemic and the economic fallout and the confusion around the pandemic that was used to remove Donald Trump. So Donald Trump is not a fascist, right? Donald Trump was trying to hold off the fascism, the woke fascism of Obama, right? The degrowth policies of the Obama administration. Because when Biden took office, right, and Biden came in and, January 6th and all of that, and Biden took office, Biden's administration is full of degrowthers, right? The head of the National Bureau of Land Management has run ads on television urging, has written scripts for ads urging people not to have children. Barack Obama's science czar is the author of, is the co-author of the book, The Population Bomb, which is a Malthusian manifesto about how there's too many people in the world. And that, the Affordable Care Act had in it, the whole, it was weird. It's like, it's wild. Let's talk about, the Affordable Care Act. Do you remember how they talked about the death panels during the Affordable Care Act? Well, obviously that was a huge exaggeration. The Affordable Care Act was an attempt to fix the U.S. healthcare system, but there was language in it hinting that the federal government wanted to promote euthanasia. And the Lyndon LaRouche movement, they discovered that, right? The LaRouche people, they operate like a think tank. They dug through, the writings of various, and they found that and they highlighted it. And then Sarah Palin and others blew it up into something it wasn't. But there was actually language in the Affordable Care Act promoting, end of life, euthanasia. Right. And Barack Obama's administration was full of Malthusians, people who believe there's too many people in the world. And the Obama administration had all these promises about hope and change. But if you listen to Obama, he hated the American working class. Right. What did he say? These bitter people who are clinging to their guns and religion. Barack Obama went to South Africa. He gave a speech and he said, if everyone on this continent had running water and electricity and air conditioning, the planet would explode. I mean, you guys can't do that. Right. He told a whole audience of African people they couldn't have a modern standard of living. They had to stay in poverty. It was pretty awful. I mean, it was pretty awful. And under Obama's administration, the degrowth policies, deindustrialization escalated. And Donald Trump was just kind of a libertarian who was using populist rhetoric to try and kind of hold off the real agenda. And at this point, the ultra rich, they've used the pandemic, they've used their control of social media. They are trying to save capitalism with degrowth, right? They are trying to save capitalism with degrowth. They have to reduce the population, reduce living standards, impoverish people around the world so that they can stay at the top of the pyramid. That's their only hope. And the biggest threat to them is Russia and China. And Biden wrote in his article for the Foreign Affairs magazine, America Must Lead Again, he wrote in his article that one of the main things he was going to do as president is stop China from building power plants around the world because they're bad for the environment. China builds power plants in Africa and it gives African people electricity for the first time. That's got to be stopped, right? Biden is a degrowther. And that they're trying to save their system with degrowth. And this is what fascism is. Fascism is degrowth. Read about it in my book or read, what was written at the time of the 1930s fascism, Fascism and Social Revolution by R. Palm Dutt. The degrowth policies have devastated the heartland of America. Living standards are dropping and the lockdowns were degrowth policies. I mean, that's what the lockdowns were. It was about reducing consumption, not letting people go places, having people stay indoors, kids not going to school. I mean, it was the lockdown policies. It was about transitioning. And in Europe, they've already started having climate lockdowns. Have you heard about this? Lockdowns that aren't about a disease. It's about we're all going to lock down and we're all going to stay in our houses and all the businesses are going to close because that's better for the environment. They're already doing this. They are already doing this. Right. And this is the agenda of the ultra rich. So now I get to the part in my speech about what can we do about it? We have got to build an anti-imperialist, anti-monopoly coalition because the lower levels of capital are being devastated by the degrowth policies. They're being devastated by deindustrialization and Malthusianism and degrowth. And Russia and China are booming economic centers. Russia's economy is doing, even though they've been isolated and cut off, their economy is still going strong, right? And India is still trading with Russia. Israel is still trading with Russia. Saudi Arabia is still trading with Russia. The Russia-Africa Forum just happened. African countries are doing business with Russia like crazy. Russia and Africa are tighter than they've ever been. China is doing amazing business in Africa, the Belt and Road Initiative. There's growth happening in the countries that are anti-imperialist. The countries that have broken out of Western capitalism and imperialism have seized control of their own economies and have a state central plan. They have 21st century socialism like China, like Venezuela, like Cuba, like Vietnam. These countries, their economy is going strong because they've broken out of Western capitalism. The lower levels of capital in the United States want growth because they want to make money, okay? And they are up at odds against the ultra-rich that are trying to save capitalism with degrowth. So we must build a working class movement for socialism to align with the lower levels of capital and build an anti-monopoly coalition in America to defeat the ultra-rich. Right. And it's really interesting that Tulsi Gabbard, I showed it last night. She was appearing on Fox News and she said what I've been saying for the longest time, that Bidenomics is fascism. And then she said it's pushed by the ultra rich. She didn't say the rich. She didn't say the ruling class. She didn't say the billionaires, the millionaires. She said the ultra rich, because I have been talking about the rich and the ultra rich. This is the divide. And I'm telling you, right, that the basis, right, the lower levels of capital the sections of the state that want to fight Al-Qaeda and terrorists, not fight Russia and China, right? We need to build a block of anti-imperialist resistance here in the center of the empire. And at this point, the focus is not about supporting one candidate or another. It's about building a network. We have got to build a network, an anti-imperialist network of people in the United States who realize that our real enemy is not in Cuba, our real enemy is not in Iran or Venezuela or Russia or China. Our real enemy is on Wall Street. People who can work together, people who can depend on each other, people who will engage in socialist education and cooperate with each other, who will teach this ideology and work to build an anti-imperialist network. Because the storm is coming, the U.S. economy has this problem of the tendency of the falling rate of profit. It has this problem of the economy not having room for millions of working people. The U.S. economy is creaking and moaning, and we're heading for another meltdown. And when that meltdown comes, we must have a network of people who are anti-imperialists who will be ready to swing into action to mobilize and build the working class anti-imperialist movement. The demand is for a government of action that will fight for working families, a government that will come into power, and put the oil and natural gas under public ownership, kick the Rockefellers out, kick the DuPonts and the Morgans out, and put oil under public ownership, put our natural resources under public ownership, that will mobilize to rebuild the country, hire millions of people to go out and build and construct, a government that'll take control of the banking system and start strategically lending money in the interest of the country, and then will enact an economic bill of rights to make sure that every American has jobs, healthcare, and education, and mobilizes the country by educating the population, by having a jobs guarantee and employing every American, by providing education, by providing healthcare. We'll be building the country. We want a government that builds, not a government that tears people down. That's what the American government does. The American government at this point is a cannibalistic government that tears people down. They have a prison system that breaks people psychologically, that tortures and destroys people. We have a military-industrial complex that goes all over the world destroying people. We have lockdowns that isolate people and destroy communities. We have drugs that are pushed on children that destroy them psychologically. We have a school system and a media and a social media apparatus that destroys people. The American government is an institution of destruction at this point. It is a violent institution of destruction. The apparatus of the American state is being utilized for no other purpose than to kill, than to destroy, than to break people, than to atomize people and demoralize people. What we need and what we should demand on behalf of the working class, on behalf of the lower levels of capital, on behalf of the small business owners, on behalf of our whole communities and our whole neighborhoods, is a government of action that mobilizes state power to build and construct, not to destroy. That is what we need. We need a government of construction, not destruction. We need a government that builds, a government that creates, a government that mobilizes the public to rebuild America. That is what we need to demand. And right now, the lower levels of capital are libertarians. They think the government can just stay out of it. Well, they're going to learn over the course of what's been happening that if the government continues to beat them down the way it is, it's not going to be enough to just say government hands off. And instead of having a government that just lets them be beaten down, a government that beats them down, or a government that just disappears, that we're going to have to demand a government of our own, a government that will kick Jeff Bezos' ass, a government that'll kick the ass of Wall Street, a government that'll mobilize people in your community, in your neighborhood, to stand arm in arm like a block and defeat the degrowth agenda, the agenda of the ultra-rich and their low-wage police state and their wars around the world. We are going to have to mobilize and educate people that the only solution, the only way to resist the degrowth fascists is with a government of action that fights for working families. That is going to be the demand, and that is what is missing from the rhetoric right now. There is not knowledge among the U.S. population about what Hugo Chavez did in Venezuela. There's not knowledge among our population about what Stalin did in Russia, or what Ba'athist Arab socialism did in Syria, or what Gaddafi did in Libya, or what Roosevelt did in this country with his limited power as he was battling his own class. We need to raise awareness and educate people about how what is needed right now is a government of action that fights for working families, a working class government. And that in China, the reason that China keeps rising is because they have a government of action. The reason Russia got out of the nightmare of the 1990s and the devastation of Boris Yeltsin was because Putin came in there and mobilized a government of action, an anti-imperialist coalition, kind of a Bonapartist, members of the elite, members of the working class, mobilized them to reject neoliberalism, Bolivarian socialism. We need to raise awareness about the need for a government of action that will fight for working families. That is what we need to do as the Center for Political Innovation. And so I conclude my opening remarks tonight by leading up to this. I've told you what happened, but I've given you an analysis about why it happened in the division in the ruling class, and now I've told you what we're going to do. And we are doing it at the Center for Political Innovation. We are the only organization in America that calls ourselves socialist that has a real strategy. Where the strategy that we hear from most socialists is that Donald Trump is a fascist, and we got to work with the ultra-rich to defeat Donald Trump. That is a strategy of marching with fascism and marching with degrowth. That's what most socialists will tell you. Other socialists will just tell you that, they're all bad and we'd read Trotsky on our own. The Center for Political Innovation and the message that we put out with Where is America Going, and in our lectures and our conferences, this is the only analysis that puts forward an understanding of the main danger being the imperialists. The imperialists are the main danger, and that there is now a material basis to build what William Z. Foster dedicated his life to building and called for in his last book, The Twilight of World Capitalism, to build an anti-monopoly coalition to defeat the imperialists. And now the basis is there for building the anti-monopoly coalition. However, the communist groups have become weak. They become isolated. They become confused. They're still following a Cold War playbook. They think they're fighting Ronald Reagan. They think they're fighting the neocons. Politics has changed, and now is the time to build an anti-monopoly coalition within America to defeat the imperialists. And the way to do that is to mobilize the population around the demand for a government of action that fights for working families. And we at the Center for Political Innovation, we are not a political party. We are not running in elections. We seek to build a network because that's what we can do right now. That is what we can do right now. We must build a network of people who understand these politics and will push for them in different spheres. We need MAGA people who will push for this analysis. We need RFK supporters who will push for this analysis. We need Cornel West supporters. We need college students who will push for this. We need people in the military who will push for this. We need people in rural states who will push for this. We need people in urban areas who will push for this. We need young folks, old folks, black, white, Arab, Asian, Latino, Christians, Muslims, Jews, atheists. We need all kinds of Americans who understand this analysis, that our job is to build an anti-monopoly coalition to defeat the ultra-rich, to defeat the imperialists, and that we can demand a government of action. That is our job, and that is what we are doing with the Center for Political Innovation. And we are building an anti-monopoly coalition. And if you look at what's happened with Rage Against the War Machine, you look at what's happening now with Humanity for Peace that's about to happen at the United Nations a week from tomorrow. If you look at what we're doing it. We're doing it. You're on the list, Hanson. We're doing it. We are building an anti-monopoly coalition, and it's difficult, but we know that ultimately when things intensify and when the crisis gets worse, that is when our duty will, that's when we'll step up to the plate. Right now, we're building a network of people who can rely on each other, who understand the nature of the crisis and have this scientific understanding, can depend on each other. We're reinventing socialism, a new aesthetic, a new message, friendliness to folks of religious faith, friendliness to conservatives, rejection of identity politics, rejection of wokeism. We're reinventing socialism as we prepare for the coming crisis. That is what we are doing. And we are preparing, we're building a network, we're educating people, we're influencing people in many different spheres with our anti-imperialist message. That's what we're doing. And I want to remind people what Mao says in the Little Red Book. In the Little Red Book, Mao points out, I think I have it marked. It's an important quote from the Little Red Book that I keep reminding people of, because it's important to understand what our role is as revolutionaries. We are not the ones who will ultimately overthrow capitalism. We won't, right? It will be other forces who do it. This is what Mao says in the Little Red Book on page 118. He says, the masses are the real heroes, while we ourselves are often childish and ignorant. And without this understanding, it is impossible to acquire even the most rudimentary knowledge. The masses have boundless creative power. They can organize themselves, concentrate on places and branches of work where they can give full play to their energy. They can concentrate on production and breadth and depth and create more and more undertakings for their own well-being. The masses are the real heroes. And our job is simply to point the masses in the right direction when the crisis comes, when the storm comes. We have to be there so that the masses, when they're ready to fight, and when they're ready to go out and sacrifice and risk it all for their communities and their families and their jobs, right? When the storm comes, and they say, from my cold, dead hands, you shall not pass. When the American people realize they have to fight to defend their jobs and their schools and their communities, we have to give them the guidance in doing so. We will not make the revolution ourselves. We will be the force of guidance that will nudge the boulder that's rolling down the mountain in the right direction. That's what we will do. The masses are the real heroes. And if Mao Zedong were living in America, he would go to the poorest corner of Appalachia and he would form a George Washington Bible gun club. The synthetic left doesn't know what they're doing, but we know what we're doing. We understand how this stuff works. We understand what's happening in the world right now with 21st century socialism. We understand why socialism in the 20th century was successful, but also understand its weaknesses. We have something very, very special. I'd like you to get involved. We got a lot of great projects going on. We have a morning message every morning that airs on the YouTube channel. We're ready to roll. So I'm really glad to have you all here tonight. If you want to join the Center for Political Innovation, we always could use more people to work on our projects and help us build the network. You can join cpiusa.org. Dues are only $10 a month, and we can plug you into our network. And on that note, folks, I will call you out as I see you. Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. All right, we got John Whitty in Houston. We got Jonathan Mahari in Stockholm, Sweden. Rice from Adelaide, Australia is with us. Welcome. We got JT24 in Mississippi. Welcome. Glad to have you with us. We got Phil Sang in Miami, Florida. We got Hanson, Ontario, the origin of Canadian evil. St. David's, Bermuda. Chris in Salt Lake City. Ian Chester in England. Bendigo, Australia, David Fox. Timoshenko, Steve in Boston. Cape Canaveral, AJ and NJ. Pittsburgh, Mitchell Sparks. Central California. Kentucky, Calvert City. Heidi in Edelweiss and Edinburgh, Scotland. Crow in Lake Isabella. Mindanao to Midwest, Lumpia Logic. That's great. Anthony in Texas. Ishmael in Los Angeles. Jamie in St. Paul, Minnesota. Maddie in California, Bob Troy in New York, Walter in PA, Pennsylvania, Balthazar in Oakland, David Rennie in Hamilton, Ontario, Maddie in California, Gonzalo in Argentina, Remy in Indiana, Rogue Valley, Oregon, right? People's Republic of Manchester. Alex from Brazil is with us tonight. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. I am so glad to be here with all of you tonight. Hit the like button. Hit the subscribe button. Hit the notifications bell. Right now, we are on Rockfin. We are on Rumble. And we are on YouTube. We are also on YouTube. So make sure you subscribe. They're messing with me on the subscribers. And I'm starting to pivot towards different platforms. I'm never going to give up being on YouTube, right? Until the day they ban me, I'm staying on YouTube. But Rumble, Rumble is much less, suppressive. So I'm going to be on Rumble, and I'm on Rockfin. And if you super chat me on Rumble, I get to keep more of it. I'll just tell you that, right? YouTube takes a third of all the super chat revenue, but Rumble takes less of it. So if you want to Rumble rant me, you'll more of it will go to support me and my work, etc. So I do want to let folks know that I am going to have a patrons only stream, coming up, and that'll be on August 1st. And I haven't done one in a while, but I will do one. But I'm trying to rebuild my Patreon. And this will be a stream for my patrons only. I have lost revenue. I have lost income significantly because of social media suppression. I don't know what's going on, but June and July, it's weird. You'd think I would have had the trouble elsewhere, but June and July, my social media revenue and these super chats and all of that has been very low. So I could use your support, trying to get things going. We got a lot of important projects coming up and such. So if you want to join the Patreon, or rejoin if you dropped off, because I kind of was not doing patrons only streams. August 1st, we will have one of our patrons only streams. It'll be small and intimate. And you'll get to, just ask me whatever's on your mind. It's usually not that many people on the patrons only stream. So you have me at your disposal. You can ask me whatever you want. So I would encourage you to sign up on my Patreon before August 1st. And August 1st, we're going to have a patrons only stream. David Fox, what's the latest with AUKUS deal in the U.S. Senate? There you go. I haven't followed that very closely, but I'll definitely answer that. All righty. All right. So now I'm going to start answering your super chat questions. All right. James Turner asks, is Gramsci a real Marxist or a synthetic leftist? I would say Gramsci was a real Marxist, but the reason you would think Gramsci was a synthetic leftist is because Gramsci's prison notebooks were not published until the 1960s. Right. So here's what you have to understand. Gramsci was the leader of the Italian Communist Party when Mussolini took power in Italy. When Mussolini took power in Italy, when Mussolini took power in Italy, as a result of that, he was thrown in prison. He was thrown in prison. And he was thrown in prison. And as a result of him being thrown in prison, he had to write in code, right? The prison censors would censor his letters that he would send to people. And he wanted to write a lot about art and culture and explain Marxism from prison. So he wrote his prison notebooks. I have a copy of them. Yeah. Right. I mean, goddamn Jeff Bezos. It has no page numbers. Can you believe a book this size with no goddamn page numbers? Fuck you, Jeff Bezos. He wrote his prison notebooks, but he couldn't use Marxist language in his prison notebooks because of the censors. So instead of saying Marxism, he said praxis, the theory of praxis, right? That was his code word for Marxism. And he couldn't say class struggle, and he couldn't say Marxism, Leninism, and he couldn't use proletarian bourgeoisie. He couldn't use Marxist language. So he wrote letters from jail to his comrades. Explaining an analysis of culture, of how art and culture and media are manipulated by the bourgeoisie, and how the base, the economic base then affects the superstructure. Giving his analysis of the way things were in Europe at the time, in Italy in particular at the time, how the culture was affected by society. And using Marxism in order to do so. There's a lot in there about Henry Ford and Taylorism. There's a lot in there about, Gramsci apparently was an advocate of sexual liberation. He was not, Stalin, as Stalin came in, there was kind of a switch, that communists became much more socially conservative. Stalin outlawed gay marriage or, homosexuality, outlawed abortion, but Gramsci is still very sexually liberal. He's also, very much, Italy and Germany and France, there's a history of feudalism there. You still have the influence of the aristocracy. And he wrote his prison notebooks kind of analyzing culture in Europe at the time, the influence of Henry Ford, the influence of Taylorism, what factory owners were pushing, the labor movement, sexual conservatism, the role of the Catholic Church, the role of art and movies, etc. That's what he's writing about. Now, the notebooks were not published as books until the 60s, right? And they were published basically by the CIA. right? The CIA was trying to reinvent Marxism and was really emphasizing, they had the Frankfurt School in Germany that was being subsidized by the Congress for Cultural Freedom program. You had Theodor Adorno, you had Herbert Marcuse, and this was all being paid for by the CIA. These Marxist intellectuals that were being promoted by the American government covertly, that were the new voices of Marxism in Europe, that were nudging Marxism to be less pro-Soviet, to be less genuinely communist, to be more focused on personality theory, psychology, anti-populism, and nonconformity. They basically, it was Pete Buttigieg's father, who, was an American academic, was the founder of the International Gramsci Society. Pete Buttigieg's father arranged for this book to be published. And even though Gramsci was the leader of the Italian Communist Party, and even though Gramsci, he was pro-Stalin, he defended Stalin, and was pro-Stalin, and was, even though that was the case, they were able to use his writings to push for what you call cultural Marxism, the synthetic left. They were able to use his writings to push that. And that's why, if you're in academia now, I studied sociology in college. Every sociology class had quotes from Gramsci on it. And they didn't know he was a communist, right? And people would get angry with me, but I would always say he's a communist. They'd be like, no, he's not. Gramsci's a smart guy. And, only stupid people are communists because communism failed everywhere it's ever been tried. And I'm like, no, Gramsci, look it up. He was the leader of the Italian Communist Party, not the Socialist Party, the Communist Party. Not the Labor Party, the Communist Party. And that's true, right? And that Gramsci, because he was subsidized as a good communist by American intelligence, because of that, he's all over academia. If you take sociology, political science, philosophy, you name it, anthropology, you're going to read Gramsci in college because first of all, there's no Marxist words in it. So it's not dangerous. No one's going to get interested in communism by reading about it because there's no Marxist buzzwords in it, number one. And number two, it's focused on the cultural arena. It's not focused on economics. He doesn't write about overproduction. He doesn't write about the tendency of the falling rate of profit. He doesn't write about imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. He doesn't write about any of the important stuff. He writes about how movies and art reflect the values of what factory owners want. He writes about how the Catholic Church and their social conservatism is making people ashamed of themselves and causing people to have shame, and that causes them to not want to go on strike. He writes about how factory owners don't want people to masturbate because then they have more nervous energy and they can work faster on the assembly line. He writes about how, people in the countryside are more conservative and more religious, but they're also like, there's more like child molestation and rape of children and stuff like that. And that it kind of goes with their social conservatism in a weird way because sexual liberation comes with sexual awareness and people are more in control of their actions. And then they acknowledge things like sexual abuse are wrong. And he writes about all kinds of stuff, right? He writes about all kinds of stuff in here, but he does not write about the basics of Marxism. It's not about economics. And he critiques what he calls economic determinism, which there's a fair critique of that, right? I mean, vulgar economic determinism is something that even Marx was critical of, right? People do act for a variety of different reasons, right? And that, if all it took was for people to, if all it took to have a revolution was people were poor, there'd be a revolution in Africa every day. But that's obviously not the case. So there's more to it than just economic determinism. Economics is important, but, you can't be a vulgar economic determinist. Gramsci is important stuff. I recommend you read it, but American intelligence and the synthetic left likes and promotes Gramsci for a reason. And you can read this and think you're a Marxist and not know anything about overproduction and the tendency of the falling rate of profit and poverty amid plenty and the basics of Marxism. And that's why there's a lot of jackasses walking around who think overproduction means everyone has too much stuff, who think you can believe in degrowth and still be a Marxist, who don't know anything about Marxism, actually believe that Marxism is everyone's poor but likes it because it's fair or something, right? You can read this stuff and not be a Marxist. In fact, I would say the majority of the people who read Gramsci are not Marxists, right? It gives you a critique of how the ruling class influences culture, about how traditional gender roles and traditional, the Roman Catholic Church, how that reinforces some of the hierarchies that exist, how factory owners manipulate their employees. That's what you're going to get from this. And you can read every word of this book and not be a Marxist, okay? And that's why it's safe for academia, and that's why they've promoted it so much. That's why the New Left loves it. That doesn't mean you shouldn't read it. I've gained a lot of insights by reading Gramsci, but there you go. That's everything you need to know about Gramsci, etc. Right? There you go. There you go. All right. Next question. How do you pick your opening remarks? Sometimes I don't know what I'm going to talk about until the last minute. Tonight, I didn't really know what I was going to talk about until like the last minute. I winged it tonight. Now, last night, I was going to talk about that clip. I found the clip of Tulsi Gabbard. The night before, I wanted to talk about Stalin, and I wanted to talk about the need for a movement, and I was having some emotions. I wanted to, I was feeling very emotional and very frustrated with the need to, it's different every night. That's my answer, Funky. Tonight, I had no idea what I was going to talk about, right? I was dealing with stuff, internally, CPI. We're trying to get some, some outreach materials together, and great job, Elizabeth, if you're watching, by the way. They're great. I'm just streaming, so I can't be in the chat, but we were trying to figure out about getting some palm cards printed and what we're doing at August 6th. And I was like to the last minute here. I was running to the grocery store and like eating an apple so I could eat before I did this stream, and running back upstairs. And, I had no idea what I was going to talk about, but I winged it tonight. And I think I did a pretty good job. Tonight I winged it and I did a good job, I think. Some of that stuff you've all heard before, but it's a good message, right? So yeah, but other nights I have a plan. The other night I did 6 things I wanted to talk about, and I just, boom, 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 went down the list. It just depends, right? Some nights I want to talk about things differently than others, so it just, every night is different. Every night is different. All right. I have not seen this debate between Hugo Chavez, and the governor of Buenos Aires. I've not seen it. Is it online with subtitles? Because I would love to watch it. Does that link that you provided, does that have subtitles in it? Because I would love to watch it. I would really, really love to watch that. That would be great. Now, John McCarthy, he appeared with the Uhuru movement. So what I'm going to do is I am going to go find that. It's probably, I think I can download that and show that on here, because it was a very important, call that the Uhuru movement did today. Hands off Uhuru. So I think I can show that. It's a 2-hour stream, so it's going to take me a while to render it. Right. But I think I can do that. I see Burning Spear TV. I see, okay. What, is it on Burning Spear TV? Is that where it aired? Right? Burning Spear, live on Burning Spear TV. Was that today? Live? 5 hours ago. Yeah, that's it. Okay, very good. So it was on Burning Spear TV. So I'm going to start downloading that, and we'll show it on here. We'll show the CPI's intervention on the important Uhuru call that happened on the anniversary. This is the anniversary of the raid on the Uhuru movement. No, it says cannot parse the link. It hasn't been up long enough. I cannot parse that link. It's not working, right? Let's see if I can find it on another channel, Uhuru Solidarity. I'm sure it was on a few different channels. But yeah, we'll show it on here. We'll show it on here. We may not show it tonight, but we'll show John's intervention because it's important. We want the whole world to know we stand in solidarity with the Uhuru movement. So yeah, I guess we'll have to show it another night because it won't parse the link. I can't bring it up on here tonight, unfortunately, John. But yeah, we support Uhuru 100%. Hands off Uhuru. We've been rallying in support of them. We are huge supporters of them. And John McCarthy has done a huge amount of work on that. Noah has stepped up to the plate. Noah in Boston has done a lot of work for Uhuru. We want to do everything we can. The new documentary that Peter Coffin is working on of our event that is going to have a lot about the Uhuru movement in their case. We want to do everything we can to support them. Everything we possibly can to support them. So there we go. So this next question, got little plumbing repair to do at a Chinese restaurant of Mijente. Now that it's closed, then to the gym, God willing, you guys solve it, BBL. I don't know quite what to say to that. I'm glad you're exercising. I try to go and exercise at the gym. Today I just kind of walked around my neighborhood because it was so hot. But I try to exercise at my gym. I do this a lot. I hold my arms up in the air. That strengthens upper body. It also like cracks my back. And I do that. I've done it. I think 19 minutes is my record of having my arms in the air, which is very good. I use weights. I also do weights for my arms. I try to get stronger, and then I do cardio when I'm at the gym. But yeah, I'm glad you're watching. I hope you'll be back later. Great. I'm glad you enjoy our stuff here. We enjoy you as well. I'm glad you're contributing with the super chat. You're part of our community. We love that. How will communism handle landlords and estates? I think that to some degree or other in 21st century socialism, there will be landlordism to some degree or other. However, I think the policy of 21st century socialism should be to maximize home ownership. The rate of home ownership in China is way bigger than in the United States. Way more Chinese folks own their own homes than in America. Cuba, the rate of home ownership is massive. And in most socialist countries, they enable working class people to own their own homes. In Cuba, the policy, I believe, is that the rent can never be more than 5% of your income, no matter what your income is. And that after you've lived in a home for 5 years, you own it. That is the policy. I know they've changed their policies. Now people are allowed to own more than one home, and they're allowed to rent out other homes. That used to be illegal in Cuba. But they've kind of liberalized on that. And in China, there is a lot of private, landlording and stuff, but they've recently been cracking down. And the Chinese government, that is one of their main priorities, to promote home ownership. And there is a much higher rate. More Chinese people own their own homes than Americans do. So there you go. That's supposed to be, they tell us that that's the staple of American capitalism. It was really wild. There's a book that I read a few years back that was a Marxist analysis of the lawn care industry and how lawn care is really an expression of alienation, right? As part of the labor aristocracy in America was lawn care, right? Is that, when the white people moved to the suburbs and thought that U.S. imperialism was great and thought that, they were middle class, they weren't working class anymore after World War II. Part of that was they had their own lawn and they mowed it perfectly. And that lawn care was a big part of alienation, and white American workers owning their own homes, which was a big thing that happened post-World War II. There was a big expansion of home ownership. The white picket fence, leave it to Beaver, that was a big part of the aristocracy of labor. Suddenly, they say communists want to seize private property. You own your own home. You own property, right? That was a big part of the aristocracy of labor. Well, what's interesting is now, as I've been telling you all on these streams, the aristocracy of labor is declining. Americans don't own their own homes anymore. All across middle America, those houses in small towns are rented now. They're owned by big banks now. Americans rent their homes from big banks increasingly. And that's a big part of, a big aspect of the aristocracy of labor was that they owned their little piece of property. Well, nowadays, increasingly, American workers in the Midwest, in the South, out West, they don't own their own homes. Now, it's not a good thing at all, but it also means that, that part of the layer to building solidarity was, the bourgeoisification, the aristocracy of labor, right? The white workers who owned their own homes in the suburbs thought they were better. Now is the time for solidarity. And that's why wokeism is so toxic, because wokeism doesn't push solidarity. It says white workers bad, black workers good. And the message needs to be that black workers suffer from things that white workers suffer also, but they suffer a lot worse. And that white workers can gain their liberation by standing in solidarity with black workers, that the police state is a threat to everyone. That the low wages are a threat to everyone. That needs to be the message. And wokeism is toxic. It's about weaponizing different sections of the population against each other. And that's why we have to fight wokeism, right? We have to fight wokeism, because wokeism is opposed to any kind of class struggle. And right now, with the labor aristocracy being demolished, there's an opportunity for class solidarity. That's what the Bernie Sanders movement was about. That's why so many Trump voters also voted for Bernie. There was the Bernie Trump voters across the country. Right? That was because of the demolition of the aristocracy of labor, right? So we have a great opportunity. And I was making that point in my live stream. What's the latest with the AUKUS deal in the U.S. Senate and the deal for Australia to manufacture missiles for the U.S.? I haven't been following that. AUKUS is Australia, UK, United States, right? And it's like a three-pronged alliance that will operate in the Pacific. The submarines and all of that. The U.S. imperialists, China is a big threat to them right now. They've targeted Russia, and Russia is more of a direct threat to the oil companies And Russia is defending itself and stuff. But China is the second largest economy in the world. China is aligned with Russia. China is aligned with Venezuela. China is aligned with many countries around the world, and they want to fight China. And Australia, they're trying to transform Australia into a base area to fight against China. And Australians should resent that. They should say, no, this is our country. We're not here to, be an outpost of American imperialism. We're not here to help the United States fight the Chinese. We should have Australia for Australians. There was great remarks recently by Maria Zakharova, who is the Russian spokesperson for the foreign ministry. And she said that the Western countries are all now colonies of the open international system, right? That we've lost our sovereignty. America is no longer sovereign to the American people. Australia is no longer sovereign to the Australians. Britain is no longer sovereign to the Britons, right? That the NATO countries are all basically colonies of this open international system, right? That wants to fight China. Australia has benefited greatly from China's economic expansion, right? Do you think Chinese President Xi Jinping's proposition, common prosperity for all humanity, is more communist or more of a leftist, simple, natural thought? I think that at the end of the day, there's only one global economy. And that when we start thinking of global trade and global economy in terms of one country winning at another country's expense, that is a recipe for disaster. And Xi Jinping talking about win-win cooperation and bringing countries together with trade is brilliant, and it's important, right? And that the imperialist system is dying, but this new economy, the Belt and Road Initiative, the Eurasian Economic Union, the Bolivarian Alternative for Latin America, the BRICS, this new economy that China is the linchpin, the center of, is the hope for the future, and Xi Jinping understands that. And by eliminating poverty in the world and raising up living standards, we can get closer to that ultimate goal of communism, a stateless, classless world based on vast material abundance and technological advancement. So yes, I do think it's very communist, right? It's communist, but you have to understand Marxism. You have to really understand Marxism in order to understand how it's communist, right? If you think communism is everyone gets paid the same, you're not going to understand this. But if you go read the Critique of the Goethe Program, you go read Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, you go read the actual words of the Communist Manifesto, you'll understand that what China is doing, China is a socialist country because the means of production are centralized and controlled. They're raising living standards, right? They've won the battle for democracy. There's a mass popular government, 90 million members of the Chinese Communist Party. They're controlling the means of production and centralizing them under state control, even though there's a lot of markets and private sectors. And they're using them to raise living standards. And they want all of humanity to be connected in a global economy where living standards are constantly rising, not going down, not degrowth like Joe Biden wants, but rising so we can reach that ultimate goal of communism. So I would say that yes, it's communist, but you have to understand what Marxism actually teaches. And nobody understands that. People read Gramsci, they read Adorno, they listen to Jabba the Vosh, wah, 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 wah. They don't understand any of this, right? But if you actually understand, you go and read Marx, you go and read Lenin, you read Xi Jinping, you read Deng Xiaoping theory, right? You read what the major communist parties in the world are putting out right now, not what Marxist doofuses in the West are putting out, not what BreadTube's putting out, not what some Marxist college professor at NYU is putting out. Go and read what the Communist Party of Vietnam is publishing. Go and read what the Chinese Communist Party is publishing in their theoretical magazine. I got some copies of it, I think, right? Kuei-shi, right? I got copies of Kuei-shi, their theoretical magazine over there. Go and read Xi Jinping's writings. Go and read what the Russian Communist Party and Gennady Zyuganov are saying. Go and read what the communists in Venezuela, what Maduro is saying. Reading. Go and read what Marta Harnecker wrote about in her writing on 21st century socialism and its role in Latin America. Go read Marta Harnecker, right? If you go and read this stuff, you'll understand what's going on, right? Go read Maduro. Go read Marta Harnecker. Go read Alexander Dugin. Even though Dugin is not a Marxist, right, and he rejects historical progress, he's an important thinker who's featured on Chinese state TV all the time because he's considered a partisan of Eurasia and anti-imperialism. Go read Dugin, right? Go read the Chinese Communist Party and their publications. Go and read this stuff. A great essay that I recommend to people, right? And I know that there's kind of a rivalry now between China and Vietnam, but this document, which I have a link to, it's called sorry, hold on, hit the wrong link. Hold on. All right, this document, right? Socialism and the Path to Socialism, Vietnam's Perspective. It came out in 2012. This document, I'm about to put the link in the chat. Go and read this document, right? This document is very good, right? And Vietnam's perspective is different than China's perspective. And, but this is by a leader, the general secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam published this document in 2012 about what socialism means and what Vietnam is doing. It's very good. It's very, very good. Go and read this document, right? Socialism and the Path to Socialism, Vietnam's Perspective. I hope we can publish this. We should publish this as the Center for Political Innovation because it's a really, really good document explaining, go and read what actual communist governments are saying. Don't read what leftists are saying, what Western who think they're Marxists are saying, because they're not Marxists, right? They believe in degrowth. They're basically fascists. Look, and I got to tell you this too. Every communist party that is in power in the world supports Russia in Ukraine. Every single one. Every single one. China supports Russia. I watch the UN meetings. They support Russia. There's no question about it. Vietnam supports Russia. Laos supports Russia. The Donetsk People's Republic, you can bet they support Russia. They're part of Russia now. They joined Russia. North Korea supports Russia. Cuba supports Russia. Venezuela supports Russia. Nicaragua supports Russia. Name one communist government that's in power that doesn't support Russia. One. There is none. Right? All these people who want to lecture us like they know communism better than us. Oh, you must be an idiot. The arrogance of these people. I can't stand it. Oh, you support Putin and you're a communist? You must be an idiot. Oh. No, because every single communist government that's actually in power supports Putin. Every single one. Every single one. So the snobbery of these people, I voted for Biden and I'm obsessed with the transgender issue and I think you're an idiot if you're a communist and support Putin. Every communist government in the world supports Putin right now. Every single one. And if that right there doesn't tell you why the Marxists of the West have no fucking clue what they are talking about, that should be all you need, because none of them support Putin. PSL doesn't support Putin. The only communists in America who support Putin right now are the Center for Political Innovation and the Party of Communist USA. That's it. That's it. None of the other ones are brave enough to support Putin. None of them will sign the World Anti-Imperialist Platform. So none of the communists in America, not CPUSA, right? They don't support Putin. Not the Party of Socialism and Liberation, not the DSA, not the Trotskyite groups, none of them. Not the Revolutionary Communist Party, not the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, none of them. None of them have the correct position on the war. That is the position of every single communist government in the world. Okay? If that there does not tell you that these American communists have no fucking clue what they're talking about. Every communist government in the world takes one position, and they take the opposite position. Why in the world, if you're a serious communist in America, you should want nothing to do with them? The Freedom Road Joker organization, you know what they do right now? They go around and they try to get conservative organizations banned from college campuses, right? They want the government to be able to ban political organizations on college campuses. You think that if there becomes a genuine, strong anti-imperialist movement, they wouldn't use that very same rule against communist groups? But Freedom Road is so much in bed with the deep state. That's what their activism consists of. They go around college campuses trying to get Turning Points USA and Young Republican clubs banned. They are not Marxists. They are not anti-imperialists. They are doofuses. And they are fascists, right? I mean, in this atmosphere where they're trying to jail the Uhuru movement for their anti-imperialism, right? What communist organization would go around and try to empower campuses to be able to ban one major political party's organizations? That's not Marxism. right? They're fascists. They're trying, the Turning Points USA, they're to some degree or other, as bad and stupid as they are, they're standing up to Biden's degrowth agenda. So Turning Points USA has Freedom Road trying to get them banned. If that doesn't tell you that they are on the wrong side, I don't know what does. Party of Socialism and Liberation. What is the main issue that they organize around? You would think it would be stopping the war because they have the Answer Coalition right now. Act Now, Stop War, and End Racism. No! The main issue that they've been organizing around, and ask Sam Bismuth, he talks about it, is abortion, right? If, they are all about abortion. They want abortion. That's right. We got to drive down the population. Those working people are breeding too much. And we got to make sure they have abortion clinics all over the red states. So those, those white trash workers don't breed. We got to, abort babies all across America. That's what they believe in. That's what PSL is fighting for. They're to abort the working class. That's what they believe in, right? Rachel Maddow, says it and they do it, right? Rachel Maddow, broadcasting from Rockefeller Center, says we have to fight for pro-choice and Planned Parenthood, started by Margaret Sanger, the sellout who abandoned Marxism and traded socialism for sex, who believed in eugenics and wanted to breed out black people. They say we got to fight for abortion rights. So that's what the party of sellout liberals, that's what their focus is on right now. Their focus is on trying to promote abortion. Now, I believe in the right to choose. I don't think abortion should be illegal. But if you think that that is the issue that communists should be focused on, you're not a communist, right? I mean, in the middle of an economic crisis with the danger of a new world war, the ruling class is setting up a police state, and your focus is, I want to make sure them working class people are aborted. That's ridiculous. That is absolutely ridiculous. You got, Freedom Road is trying to ban all conservative organizations from college campuses, right? PSL is trying to get abortions everywhere, right? CNN, Rachel Maddow and PSL and CNN are in a coalition to make sure we got abortions going on everywhere, right? The Communist Party USA wants to ban firearms. They support gun control. Their members in Connecticut run and work for a nonprofit that was set up to remember Sandy Hook, and they're promoting the Second Amendment. This is what the communists in America are trying to do. They want to take away your guns, they want to abort your babies, and they want to ban Republican organizations. That has nothing to do with communism. And, are these issues we might care about? Sure, right? We, historically, we're for a secular government, right? Many communists are pro-choice, right? Republican organizations, if they're preaching racism, we might want to oppose. I mean, an argument could be made that these are issues that communists should point to, right? But if the country is on the brink of World War III with Russia, if people are hungry and starving and the roads are falling apart and the power grids are collapsing and your country is economically devastated, if they're trying to throw the Uhuru movement in federal prison for speaking up for Russia, what the fuck are you doing as a Marxist? If your focus is on abortion and getting rid of the Second Amendment and banning Republican clubs, you are on the wrong side. You are on the wrong side. Freedom Road Socialist Organization is on the wrong side. They say they support Venezuela. They say they support Cuba. They say they support China and North Korea. They are on the wrong side. And the same goes to the Communist Party USA. They are on the wrong side. They are on the wrong side. And the PSL is on the wrong side. Our job, we need to oppose the danger of a new world war. We need to support the working class and call for rebuilding this country and economic justice. And we need to oppose the police state and support the Uhuru movement and support people on college campuses being able to question the war in Russia, not being banned because their views aren't politically correct. We should oppose censorship on the campuses. These people are on the wrong side. They are on the wrong side. They want to throw us in jail because we support Russia, because they want to give campuses, college campuses, the power to ban organizations that aren't politically correct. And the wokes think Russia is a fascist country. So they want to give public universities the right to ban an organization just because someone on the internet says you're racist. You're racist, right? That's what they want to do. Is Turning Points USA racist? Maybe, but they should be allowed to have their organization. Right? Republicans, if you ban Republicans from organizing on college campuses, we're next, right? I mean, that doesn't occur to them. They don't see the Uhuru movement. They claim to support the Uhuru movement. They see the Uhuru movement having their homes raided. Like, why in the world at this time would you support that, right? The abortion issue. Do you think millions of Rust Belt working class people that are Roman Catholic, that are evangelical, do you think that you're going to win them to communism? Do you think you're going to win them to communism by going to them and saying, I want to have abortion? You will never change anyone's mind on that issue. If you make abortion the main thing that you're for, all you're doing is you're telling every evangelical Christian, every Catholic, every Muslim, every Orthodox Jew, every religious person, we don't want you in our organization. You're waging a culture war against religious people who could be on your side to oppose World War III, who could be on your side for economic justice, and you're alienating them to kiss up to Rachel Maddow and Joe Biden. That is idiotic. And the Second Amendment, I mean, don't get me started about it. They are on the wrong side. They are on, it's like the Roosevelt years, right? Fascism is on the march, and they're on the wrong side. What's your comment on Kim Iverson's interview with Liz Wheeler? Well, look, Liz Wheeler, again, this is the brilliance of it, of our enemy, right? Liz Wheeler is claiming that a lot of the woke stuff in our schools nowadays that a lot of conservatives don't like is communist. And my comment to that is, go to China, where they have a communist government. Do you think that they're pushing transgenderism in Chinese schools? Go to Cuba. Yes, in Cuba, they do promote gay marriage. And yes, they have gay rights in Cuba. But do you think they're pushing transgenderism in Cuba? Go to North Korea. Do you think in the North Korean schools they're pushing this stuff, right? What communist governments do and what woke people do are not the same. And anyone who's ever been to a communist country, which I have, knows that for a fact. I have been to the neighborhoods in Central Caracas where they love Hugo Chavez, and those people are anti-abortion and they're anti-gay marriage and they're evangelical and they're Christian. Go to Nicaragua. I've been to Nicaragua. I've been to worker cooperatives in Nicaragua. Those people definitely aren't teaching, critical race theory and transgenderism in their schools. Now, to be fair, if a child is trans, they shouldn't be bullied in school. Right. And I'm not necessarily against having, training for teachers to make sure that kids don't get bullied, to make sure kids don't feel ashamed. You know what I mean? I'm not necessarily against that. Right. And Liz Wheeler is appealing to conservatives. But what pisses me off about this kind of stuff is that she calls stuff that conservatives don't like, she calls it communism. And anyone who's been to any communist country knows that ain't communism. Right. And it pisses me off to the nth degree. To the nth degree, it pisses me off to see American communists who can't wrap their minds around it. Right. And that there's just too much. The communist groups in America have decided the only people they'll ever recruit are liberal Democrats. Right. They decided this in like the 70s. The only people we'll ever recruit are liberal Democrats. And so their whole existence is about how can we organize protests for liberal Democrats? How can we publish books liberal Democrats will buy? How can we say things? How can we get an ad in the New York Times that liberal Democrats will sign? The whole orientation of these people is how can we pander to liberal Democrats because they're the only people that want to hear us? Well, if you're a genuine communist right now, the liberal Democrats are the people that want to kill you the most, right? Whereas now the working class is awakening and that doesn't mean we have to, I don't think anyone should be discriminated against. I think gay people should be able to get married. I think trans people, if you want to live your life as a trans person, that's your business and no one else's, but that said, when you equate communism with these cultural issues that no one's going to change their mind on, all you're doing is isolating communists from the working class. So that's my response to Liz. And Liz Wheeler plays right into that. Right. And that's what these people don't get, right? These pseudo-communists who claim to be hardline Marxist-Leninists, claim to be tankies, and they're marching with Vosh and ContraPoints. I mean, there you go. There you go. That's all I got to say, folks. Well, it's been fun. It's been a fun stream, and I will be back. I will be back tomorrow night. If you can sign up and join me on Patreon, that would be awesome. We're going to have a patrons only stream on August 1st. Tune in. There's going to be a great morning message tomorrow from yet another member of the Center for Political Innovation. August 6th is going to be a great day of protest, and I'm going to put on the closing music. And we will be back soon. We will be back soon, probably tomorrow, unless, extenuating circumstances. We'll be back tomorrow. Upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.